Graham Phillips, welcome back to the program.
Hello, Russell. Thank you very much indeed.
Graham Phillips is a well-known British author of several books, including The Search for the Grail, The Templars and the Ark of the Covenant, Merlin and the Discovery of Avon and the New World. He has also co-written a number of books with Martin Keatman, including The Shakespeare Conspiracy, and that's the book we'll be talking about today. Graham, if you can please give us the accepted historical version of the young life of William Shakespeare.
William Shakespeare, as we are taught in schools and as most people tend to know about him, was basically born in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is in central England. He was educated locally in the local equivalent of a grammar school. He then married a lady called Anne Hathaway locally, and his marriage was very happy. He had some children. To earn a bit of money, he decided to go down to London and work in the theatre, because at that time, in the Elizabethan period, the theatre was just becoming popular, particularly in London, and he got himself a job as a stagehand. He sent money back to his wife and family in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is about 100 miles to the north, and he quickly rose to become an actor. And before too long, he started trying his hand writing plays in this theatre troupe that he belonged to. And he did very well. And very quickly, many of the greatest and most powerful people in the land came to see these shows at the theatres in London where he was performing. And so he became an actor and a director and writer of plays, and these plays became famous throughout the country. And Shakespeare, well, the story then goes that he became so famous that he is known as the greatest writer who ever lived. That's the straightforward story of William Shakespeare, the lovely, happy family man and great playwright that we all know and love.
And they say he had a vocabulary of almost 30,000 words. Perhaps an average person today might use maybe 2,000, or if you're me, maybe 1,000.
That's quite incredible, really, because the first English dictionary wasn't written until about 150 years after Shakespeare's time. So how he had so many words, he certainly uses that many words in his works, he must have been extremely widely read. He couldn't just consult a dictionary.
Right, so how did a guy grown up in Stratford-upon-Avon become this incredible writer?
Well, this is where the mystery begins, because according to, as far as anybody can tell, he went to a pretty ordinary school for a few years in Stratford-upon-Avon, which would have just taught them the basics of reading, writing and arithmetic, a few other things. But for this vast knowledge that he seems to have accumulated, not only of all these words, but of all the historical details that he needed to have known to have written these plays, he surely at the very least had to have gone to some major university or to one of the British public schools, as they're called, the big private schools like Eton and Harrow, where all the leaders of the country and the greatest minds came from. But there's no evidence that he went to any other school apart from this little school in Stratford-upon-Avon. So that's the first mystery that confronts us about Shakespeare. Where did he get all this information? And if he was so clever and so well-read and so knowledgeable, how come he ended up getting a job cleaning the stage at the theatres in London to start off with? Why wasn't he doing something else?
And he would have had to have known Greek, Latin, French, and Italian.
Yeah, that's the next thing. Not only does this guy have to have known all sorts of things about Roman history, Greek history, British history, and so forth, he would have had to have known the geography of Europe pretty well. I mean, he's writing plays about Denmark, such as Hamlet. He's writing plays that are set in Italy, such as Romeo and Juliet. But he's also writing about ancient history, such as Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra. And he writes a lot there showing that he understands Latin. I mean, not only does he include bits of Latin and Greek in his works, he also seems to have consulted works about the history, say, of Julius Caesar, which would only be available in Latin at the time. So yes, he must have spoken a number of different languages, including a number of ancient languages. This man was highly educated, and he must have gone to some major university, if nothing else. But there's no record of him anywhere having done that.
He also invented a number of words, so not only was he well educated and well read, he was inventing his own language.
Yeah, one of the words he invented was, he used to say in one of his plays, mum's the word for you know, just between you and me. Mum is the word. Nobody actually knows where he got that from, and that's an example of something he seems to have thought up. Mum for, you know, between you and me, laddie.
He's so well quoted that most people get his quotes and the Bible's mixed up.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. It's the reason why people tend to mix up Shakespeare and the Bible is because they both sound the same. They're both with these these and thous and so forth, which some people refer to as Old English. Actually, that wasn't Old English. It's what's called early modern English. Old English is what was spoken by the Anglo-Saxons sort of 1,500 years ago, and they would have spoken almost what's now German. Middle English, which is the language spoken by Chaucer, and a line from Chaucer would be, "'Twas once a poor widow, somewhat starop in age." Translated, there was once a poor widow, somewhat bent with age. You could hardly understand it. But early modern English is the these and thous. You can understand it, but it takes a bit of getting your head round. And that's the languages that were spoken widely in Britain at the time of William Shakespeare, towards the end of the 1500s, around 1600, early 1600s, that time. Now, it just so happens that the King James I Bible, which is what we now have as the main Bible today, is the one with all these these and thous in it. And it was written in the language of spoken at the time. So that, in other words, Shakespeare wrote at the same time as the King James I Bible we all use today was translated into English. Hence why people think Shakespeare spoke like the ancient Israelites, or the ancient Israelites spoke like Shakespeare. There was actually, and in Victorian times, there was a number of religious groups in Britain and elsewhere in the world who actually believed that God spoke in that Shakespearean way. In other words, God did say, "Unto Moses, come thou here," etc., and "Verily I say unto thee." Of course, well, if God spoke like that, isn't it strange that Shakespeare also spoke in God's language? There was a lot of confusion in Victorian times about why these two are speaking the same. And of course, as you say, that gave rise to a lot of confusion between the two. You know, Shakespeare is often quoted as a biblical quote and vice versa.
You mentioned Israelites. Many have accused Shakespeare of being anti-Semitic. The character of Shylock, you know, in The Merchant of Venice, for example.
He was. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Britain at that time. But more than being anti-Semitic, he also seems to have been very anti-Catholic. In fact, very anti anybody who Queen Elizabeth I and her successor James I didn't like.
But Shakespeare's father was sympathetic to the Catholics.
Yeah, now this is another mystery I'll come on to in a bit. The Shakespeare who's writing these plays doesn't seem to be very sympathetic to the Catholics. Yet the Shakespeare from Stratford-upon-Avon does seem to have been a Catholic. At least he certainly was born one. But these are just some of the mysteries that originally got me thinking, hold on a minute, maybe William Shakespeare isn't all he's cracked up to be. I'd be very interested in finding out what else about him is mysterious. And that's when I began my research for my Shakespeare book. And what I found out about Shakespeare, or the discrepancies about the historical Shakespeare with the one as he is portrayed, you know, popularly today, were incredible. The real William Shakespeare, it was nothing like the William Shakespeare we all know and love.
Now, who is the real William Shakespeare? Is he, in fact, Christopher Marlowe?
No, there was a number of authors have proposed theories that the reason why Shakespeare is so mysterious, and there are things about him that don't tend to tie up with the playwright, like, for example, what we mentioned earlier, about the fact that he seems to have not had the education to have been such a great playwright. They explain that by saying, well, perhaps William Shakespeare never really wrote these plays. Yes, this man from Stratford-upon-Avon could have gone down to London and worked in the theatre as a stagehand. He may even been an actor, but he can't have been the person who wrote the plays. Some great learned gentleman obviously wrote the plays. Perhaps even a woman wrote the plays, and for some reason or other decided that they did not want to be associated with them, perhaps because they might fear getting the head lopped off if somebody like the Queen took a dislike to these plays. So they chose, so somebody, for example, like the well-known playwright Christopher Marlowe, who was contemporary with Shakespeare, or Francis Bacon, who was a political figure in Shakespeare's time, and other figures, the Earl of Oxford, have been put forward as possible writers of these plays, and they chose the stagehand come actor William Shakespeare to front the plays. But I didn't see how this fitted myself personally. I mean, for a start, if you're going to use somebody else as a front man for whatever reason, then surely this front man is going to be somebody who writes plays. It's going to be somebody who's feasible. You'd pick somebody else who was educated, somebody else who tried his hand at playwriting. You wouldn't pick a stagehand who seems to be, well, of a very limited education. So it just didn't seem to make sense to me that the answer to the strange mystery of William Shakespeare's background, and he doesn't seem to be fitted to be a playwright, the answer can't be that he's a front man for somebody else. There's got to be another answer. And that's what my research, that's what started me off. And my research followed that. And I thought, well, let's start at the very beginning and find out what we can that's historically recorded in documentation about William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon.
So what have you learned?
Well, the first thing I decided to do, and it seemed quite appropriate really, was to go to where Shakespeare is buried in Trinity Church in Stratford. And there, when you go into the church, because in fact in this country you go into a church, an old church, and you go in and you can give some money into the collection plate if you want to keep, help with the upkeep of the building. But the only church I know of in this country where you actually have to pay to go in is where Shakespeare's buried, because he gets so many tourists. So you actually pay to go in. You go, I don't know if you actually said, I'm going in to pray, vicar, can I come in and pray? Do I have to pay then? I have no idea. But you have to pay if you're going to look at his tomb. So anyway, you go and look at his tomb, and there near the altar, there's a slab on the floor saying that this is where Shakespeare is buried, and above it on the wall is a bust of William Shakespeare, his head, shoulders, hands, and part of his torso. And he has his, it's a Shakespeare we all recognise, the bald-headed gentleman with the pointed beard. And he's got his hands in front of him, and in one hand he's got a parchment, and in the other hand he's got a pen, and he's set it down in front of him as if he's about to write. That is the bust of William Shakespeare that's there. So those who would say that, well, maybe William Shakespeare of Stratford wasn't really a playwright will point to that bust on the wall in Trinity Church and say, well, if he wasn't a playwright, how come that bust depicts him as one? And of course that gets you scratching your head. So I thought, well, I did something which no one else seems to have done before me, and that was to have a look to see the history of that bust. I mean, does it actually date from the time Shakespeare, or is it the original? And the answer is no, it isn't. If you go into the Stratford Record Library, in there is a book by a man called William Dugdale. He was an architect who wandered around Warwickshire, which is the county around Stratford-upon-Avon, making drawings of different churches and the tombs and monuments that they had inside them as a kind of architectural thesis. And he draws a picture of the original bust on Shakespeare's tomb. Now, yes, and he did this in the early 1600s, perhaps 20 or 30 years after Shakespeare died. And yes, he does show a bust of William Shakespeare, and it says, William Shakespeare lies here. And the bust does show a man with a pointy beard and a balding head. and he does have his hands out in front of him, but he doesn't have a pen in one hand, a feather pen, and he doesn't have a parchment in the other. His hands are resting on a sack, like a sack for containing commodities like wheat or barley or something. Now, the tradition was at that time, in the early 17th century, when someone died, the bust would depict them doing what they did in life as a job. This person commemorated, this William Shakespeare commemorated by the bust, the statue in Holy Trinity Church, Stratford, was a dealer in bagged commodities, not a playwright. And I thought, well, how come there's a picture there? How come the bust there now shows him with his pen and parchment? Well, the records show that that wasn't put there until 1744 by a theatrical agent who wanted to promote the town. The original had crumbled away. He'd pay to have it repaired. And because by that time it was considered that William Shakespeare of Stratford was the playwright, it's more fitting to have the man with a pen and parchment than his hand on a malt sack, as it appeared to be. So in other words, when Shakespeare died in Stratford in the early 1600s, whatever he was, whatever he did, whether he wrote plays or not, everybody in Stratford remembered him as a dealer in bagged commodities. So I looked into the historical documentation, the records of the town, and found quite a number of mentions of William Shakespeare. But all of them are concerning him in commercial enterprises. For example, he buys up many hundreds of acres of land to grow wheat and barley for the malt industry. He sells wheat and barley to the malt. In other words, he's preparing grain to make beer. And all the transactions involving William Shakespeare that survive have him buying and selling things to do with the brewery trade. And, of course, this is how he's remembered in the bust in the church. So William Shakespeare made his living as a businessman involved in the brewery trade. Was there any record of him ever being a playwright? Well, through all the records that survive of him in Stratford-upon-Avon, there is records of him buying property, selling it, lending money, but there is not one thing concerning him being a playwright or a writer or an intellectual of any kind.
Are these purchases after the age of 30, or what age is Shakespeare at the time he's purchasing the land?
These purchases start from around about the age of 30, which is, incidentally, around about the time he first appears down in London.
That's when he perhaps could have had the money to finance some of these other ventures, yeah?
Yes. Now, some people would say, those who believe that Shakespeare is as we believe him to be, is that in about 1590, 1593, when Shakespeare is a man, he becomes a playwright in London, or at least becomes an actor first and then quickly a playwright. At the same time, he's buying land and selling molten grain and so on and so forth. And therefore, he's perhaps earning the money now to finance himself as a playwright. And that makes sense. But, and this is what I found, I went to London and looked at all the records pertaining to Shakespeare in London, in an area of London called Blackfriars, which is where he lived, which is like the East End of London. And there's records of him there. One particular record of him in London in the 1590s, early 1593 I believe it is, says that William Shakespeare has run out on a debt of 5 shillings. That's 25 pence, a quarter of a pound, less than half a dollar by today's money. I suppose if you sort of take into consideration inflation, he's running out of a debt of about 50 or 100 pounds, or 50 to $100. So he's running away from this debt. It's his rent for a small room that he rents in a rather slummy area of London. So he's living in a squalid little apartment, and he can't afford the rent, so the local authorities are after him to pay it. That's one record in 1593. Another record says that at this time, William Shakespeare is had up for being drunk and disorderly. There is a warrant issued against him for owing money to a bar, a pub. There is also he's arrested for fighting on a number of occasions, threatening the life of one of his fellow actors, and constantly borrowing money from people, small quantities of money, sort of 5 shillings, 10 shillings, which would be like £100, £200 today. Now, at exactly the same time in Stratford-upon-Avon, William Shakespeare of Stratford is buying the second largest house in the town, New Place, which you can actually go around today, or at least the gardens of what was once his house, for £50. Now that would be like thousands of pounds today. He's buying in the same week as he is being sought for this small amount of money in London, he buys 400 acres of land in Stratford-upon-Avon. At the same time as he is being sought for a small amount of money that he still owes this local pub, this bar, he is lending large sums of money to people in Stratford-upon-Avon. So for the first time, I think that I managed to find out historically something about Shakespeare that nobody else seems to realise, because they hadn't compared the two sets of records, is, if nothing else, he was leading a very strange double life. Rich grain merchant and money lender in Stratford, at the same time, poor, struggling playwright in London, which just is even more bizarre than anything I had thought of before.
How do you know it's the same William Shakespeare?
Now this is where I began to think maybe we're talking about two separate Shakespeares here. Maybe the William Shakespeare who came from London is a completely different one. They've just got them confused along the way.
And perhaps the town took advantage of that misunderstanding and adopted that William Shakespeare as their own.
Yeah, but this is the first theory I came up with. They can't be the same person. And there is, in fact, near where Shakespeare lived in London, in the East End of London, that we'll call it the London Shakespeare and the Stratford Shakespeare, just for the moment, in case they are two people, just to save confusion. The London Shakespeare lives very close to a borough of London called Stratford. It's where they held the Olympic Games last. That's where the Olympic Stadium was, in Stratford, in East London. Now, he lived very close to that. Maybe there was writing about Shakespeare of Stratford, and people people in Stratford-upon-Avon, another place called Stratford in Warwickshire, 100 miles to the north, found there was a William Shakespeare that lived there and decided it was one and the same person. I mean, it's possible on account of the fact it was around about 70 years after Shakespeare's death that his plays were popular when he was alive, but nobody really cared about who wrote them. It was only much later on, about 70 years later, after he died, that people started to think, who is this Shakespeare? So it's possible that when they started to look into it, they found Stratford, Shakespeare here, this is the same guy. William Shakespeare, was it a common name at the time? Well, I managed to find out there were quite a few William Shakespeares around throughout Britain at that time. It wasn't that much of an uncommon name. William certainly wasn't. And the name Shakespeare was more common then than it is today. So it is possible you're talking about two completely separate people. Now, this really annoyed the good people of Stratford-upon-Avon. And the visitor centre there, which owns the Shakespeare Trust, which owns the places where he lived, and the same people presumably charge you to go and look at his tomb, and they've got a huge, great reading library and museum there. I turned up one day, and the girl on the reception said, Mr. Phillips. And I thought, how does she know who I am? And she said, I'm terribly sorry, but you're not allowed in. You've been barred. I said, what? She said, I'm terribly sorry, you've been writing these defamatory things about Mr. Shakespeare. I said, how could defamatory? The man's been dead for centuries. And she said, well, I'm terribly sorry, but the powers that be have decided you can't come in and use our facilities. This is a private setup and you can't come in. I said, well, how did you know who I was? And she was quite friendly to me. She said, well, I'm sorry, and under the desk they had a picture of me. There was a number of banned people, which included me and the Prime Minister at the time, John Major. Why he wasn't allowed in, I've got no idea. So I was amongst this illustrious company for not being allowed into the Shakespeare visitor centre. And as I said, they even had a photograph there of me. So that stopped me doing a lot of my research at that point. But until I managed to discover I managed to get hold of a copy of the will of William Shakespeare, which they actually keep in there, so I couldn't see the original, but I did see a photocopy of it. I had to get friends of mine to go in and get photocopies and sneak them out so I could see them. And the interesting thing is, in the will of William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, there is mention of the shares that he owned in the Globe Theatre in London. So it's got to be the same guy. So we know it's the same guy, therefore he must be leading a weird double life. The question is why? I decided that the first possibility of why William Shakespeare seemed to be living this double life is that he was trying to get away from his wife or something, and his family, or that he was on the run. I mean, the man was a businessman. Maybe he'd made enemies. Maybe he was sneaking off to London to get away from people who were after him. Maybe he didn't want to draw attention to himself in London, so he pretended to be poor. Maybe he pretended to be poor in London, so he got on with the other playwrights. If they knew he was a rich businessman, maybe they wouldn't like him. Maybe he wouldn't be accepted as one of them. I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities like that. So I decided to look into the relationship he had with his family. Now, one of the legends, if I want to call it that, of William Shakespeare, he was a nice family man, went to church every Sunday, got on well with his wife, and so on. Well, it seems that he just went off and left his wife to look after all their kids on her own. Now, people say, oh, no, he didn't spend, he was sending the money back to her, etc. He didn't need to send money back to her because he had loads in Stratford anyway. She was living in the second biggest house in the town. So any idea that he was working in London, being a playwright, to send her money back is nonsense. Playwrights at the time got about £5 for each manuscript that could take them months and months to write. And that, I suppose that'd be like getting £500 or £600 now, maybe $1,000, and not a lot for like 9 months' work or something. So he's not going down there to earn money, and she's got plenty at home anyway. But the thing that proved to me that William Shakespeare really didn't have this loving, wonderful relationship with his wife is found in his will that I've got the copy of. Or he's a very wealthy man. He leaves property to people left, right and centre, leaves money to his daughter. But the only thing he leaves his wife, I mean, if he left her absolutely nothing, that would be fairly insulting. But he adds insult to injury by leaving her one thing, his second best bed. He specifically says, I leave my wife, Anne Hathaway, my second best bed. Well, what happened to the first best one?
Right, he was having an affair in London.
He must have been either having an affair in London, or that seems to have been, what it suggests.
Perhaps he was a closeted homosexual.
He could have been, but whatever. He was having an affair with somebody. There was somebody better than her.
Yeah, clearly, the first bed. There's in fact an unpublished series of poems about a character having a homosexual relationship with a younger man.
Whether Shakespeare was gay or not is something which is far from clear. Some of his poems that he wrote are written to a man, and they are written in a way which seems to show a sexual relationship of some kind. But the thing was that every person who was a playwright or a poet at the time needed a patron. Now, the patron would pay to get these things published, but that's not all. They would put in a good word at court and make sure that the local authorities you had to get permission to put plays on, and you needed the local mayor or whatever to give you permission. And you had to have somebody fairly important backing your endeavours for the local mayor to say, yes, you can have permission to put this play on, and so forth. So even if you had loads of money and you could afford to publish your own stuff, you still needed an important patron, somebody who was a lord, for example, in order to patronise you, not necessarily give you money, but to say, I put the weight of my name behind this guy, he's all right. So Shakespeare needed a patron, and the person who was his patron was the Earl of Southampton, a quite close friend of the Queen. And the Earl of Southampton was openly gay, and all his friends were openly gay. They may have been bisexual, but they were certainly gay a lot of the time. And the Earl of Southampton was gay. There's no doubt about that. He patronised Shakespeare, so Shakespeare may have been writing these plays to appeal to his patron, or he may have been writing them for his patron to read out to his own lover or lovers. So the fact that he wrote poems, sonnets, that appear to be, as if he may himself have been homosexual or bisexual, he may have simply been doing this to please his patron. But whether it was a man or a woman, he seems to have been having an affair with somebody else, which is why he left his wife his second best bed.
Well, what's your theory, Graham?
Well, the fact that he wasn't as nice to his wife, shall we say, as he is made out to be, the fact that there is a mystery concerning his education, the fact that he seems to have been leading this double life is all very mysterious, because if he wasn't educated in Stratford-upon-Avon, and yet it is the same man who wrote these plays, where did he get all this knowledge? How did he know intimately the different courts of Europe? How did he know the geography of Europe to the extent that he did? Where did he pick up this huge vocabulary that you mentioned earlier? Where did he learn to speak foreign languages? How did he know so much about history? Whose libraries was he learning? You couldn't just go down the local library in those days. Libraries were owned by very rich lords, and these people had their own personal libraries, and you had to get, involved with these people in order to read their books. However Shakespeare was doing it, he was widely travelled, and he was getting to know a lot of people in a lot of high places. And I thought, well, how is he doing this? He starts in Stratford, he goes down to London, he gets himself a job in the theatre, and the next thing he's mixing with all the sort of top people in the country. I mean, how is this happening? So I thought, let's look at how he gets going. For whatever reason, he went to London to become a stagehand, perhaps because he's going down there to have an affair with somebody or whatever else. He gets involved in the theatre in London. First of all, he's an actor. He's obviously wants to make his name in the theatre, but he's not getting anywhere. Until in 1593, the biggest playwright in the country, Christopher Marlowe, who you mentioned earlier, suddenly dies under mysterious circumstances. He goes out to a pub one night and gets involved in an argument, and he gets stabbed. This leaves the theatre company that Shakespeare worked for without a playwright. They haven't got anybody to write plays for them. Immediately, William Shakespeare is picked out to replace Christopher Marlowe, even though he doesn't seem to have any education or experience that we know of. Thereafter, Shakespeare starts producing plays left, right and centre, the likes of which no one has ever seen before. So he takes over exactly when Christopher Marlowe dies. Is there a connection here? Is there some connection between Shakespeare and Marlowe other than the fact they obviously knew each other? Well, what we do know about Christopher Marlowe is that apart from being a playwright, he worked as a government spy. Now, this might sound a bit strange, but the Secret Service in Britain was set up by Queen Elizabeth's equivalent to Prime Minister. That's Francis Walsingham, his name.
Yes, Sir Francis Walsingham.
Sir Francis Walsingham. He's known as the Spy Master. Now, Sir Francis Walsingham, he also invented all sorts of hideous tortures for people, like hanging, drawing and quartering, but that's another story. He wasn't a very nice man. But he set up the Secret Service not to go and spy in Russia or Germany or anywhere else. He set it up to spy in England or in England and Wales, and he set it up to spy on Catholics. Now, Britain had been a Protestant country under Queen Elizabeth, and not long before her, immediately before her, sister had ruled, who was Queen Mary, who was a Catholic. And Queen Mary, who got the nickname Bloody Queen Mary, used to basically burn Protestants for breakfast. I mean, she was a nasty piece of work and a fanatical religious woman who used to persecute Protestants. Elizabeth came to the throne when Mary died. She was a Protestant. She didn't really persecute Catholics. Catholics weren't treated too well, but she didn't actually go out, persecuting them. But Her minister, her chief minister, Francis Walsingham, feared that when Elizabeth died, the country might revert back to Catholicism, because the next in line to the throne was Elizabeth's cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, who was a Catholic. Now, the first person to get his head chopped off if the Catholics came back would be Francis Walsingham. So he decided to basically try and find out. He wanted to get Mary Queen of Scots executed. He wanted to, and Elizabeth, because she used to be the Queen of Scotland, there'd been a revolution in Scotland, the Protestants had taken over there, she'd fled to England. Elizabeth took her in, but kept her under kind of house arrest in a big castle. And when Elizabeth didn't marry, and it didn't look like she was going to have any children, it looked as if Mary would become queen. She would be a Catholic. She'd get rid of Walsingham. Walsingham wanted to implicate Mary in a plot to overthrow Elizabeth so he could get rid of her, so Elizabeth would have her head chopped off. So part of him in getting involved in trying to make out that Mary Queen of Scots was a Catholic rebel, he had to have spies going around the country finding out which landowners, which lords were Protestants and which were Protestants only on the surface of it, but were really secret Catholics. Now, in order to do this, he needed to set up the Secret Service, which he did, calling it the Secret Service. He had to get people who would work well as spies. Well, he decided that the best people to work as spies would be people who could freely travel around the country, which most people didn't, and mix with the rich and famous. And the best people to do this, he figured, were people involved in the theatre, travelling players. They would turn up at somebody's stately home, a lord's stately home. They'd perform their plays, they'd be the entertainment, and they'd very often mix with these lords and ladies in a way that most ordinary people would never get a chance to do at all. So they travel widely, they mix in the right places. And Walsingham says, I'll pay you a bit of cash, well, a lot of cash actually, if you report back to me just what you see. Do you hear anybody when they're drunk talking about being a Catholic? Can you see any evidence they might be? He wanted to know who was on his side and who was on the Catholic side. And he had all these playwrights going around the country, and because most of these playwrights were also actors and directors of their plays, they were travelling players, and he employed these people to work on his behalf. And one of his leading spies had been Christopher Marlowe. This is known from all various historical records that have been discovered. And when he died, Shakespeare suddenly gets all the glory that Marlowe was getting. His players suddenly get all the commissions that Marlowe's people were getting. And the head of Shakespeare's group of players was a man called Lord Strange. Sounds like an interesting name. His name was Ferdinando Stanley, and Strange is a place near Manchester, so he was lord of it. There was nothing strange about him. Well, there might have been, but he came from a place called Strange, and that's why he was Lord Strange. And Shakespeare's players at that point were known as Lord Strange's men. Lord Strange was the patron originally of Marlowe's players. Now Shakespeare took over. Lord Strange, historical evidence shows that he was up to his neck in the Secret Service. He was one of Francis Walsingham's lieutenants. He was one of his top men. And you look more into the Lord Strange's men, these players that Marlowe and then Shakespeare were writing for, and nearly every one of them was in the pay of Francis Walsingham's Secret Service. So it seems almost impossible that William Shakespeare wasn't involved in it. And it seems, because he suddenly got all the commissions that Marlowe had been getting, and the reason he was getting all those commissions, but from the government and from various lords, is so that he could go around the country and spy for Walsingham. It seems that Shakespeare took on this role. So one of the reasons Shakespeare might have been leading a strange double life is he was, in fact, a government spy. He had, well, put it this way, he had a license to quill.
So in other words, Christopher Marlowe was a spy for the government, and he fell out of favor, and they passed the torch on to Shakespeare.
Yes, that is almost, I mean, I've looked through the historical records to find out any payments that were made to William Shakespeare. But unfortunately, most of the historical records about who was paying these spies have been lost to history. Whether they existed in the first place or not, who knows? But there's certainly no evidence that Shakespeare was being paid. But then again, there's no evidence that any of the others were being paid. But we know that the others were spies because they're mentioned in various dispatches. I haven't found that evidence for William Shakespeare, but the circumstantial evidence of him being in the right place at the right time, or whatever you want to call it, wrong place at the wrong time maybe, is because he himself was a spy. He took over from Christopher Marlowe. This would explain his strange double life in some ways. In other words, if it got known in London that he was this rich grain merchant, people would be asking, well, why is he working as a playwright and an actor? That still doesn't explain why he went to London in the first. Perhaps, okay, I'll give a guess. He lives in Stratford, wealthy man, meets some man or woman in London he falls for, goes to see them down there, gets involved in the theatre so that he can go and have this affair with whoever it is in London. He doesn't want people in London to really know who he is, so he keeps his two lives secret. He just so happens to be involved in the theatre because perhaps the person he's having this affair with is also involved in the theatre in some capacity. And then what happens is he inadvertently, or vertently, if there is such a word, gets involved in the Secret Service, and therefore he has this double life, which is perfect to cover up his spying activities. He travels the country with these travelling players. If anyone finds out that he's a rich man, they'll think, well, it'll draw suspicion, it'll draw attention to him. And that's the last thing he wants as a government spy. So he keeps this pretense up. And that, I think, is the answer to the mystery of William Shakespeare's strange life.
But Shakespeare was famous, so it would have been accepted that he would have had money, no?
Two answers to that. One, he wasn't famous at the time for being the great Mr. Shakespeare. It was the players that were famous, the Lord Strange's Men, or later called the Queen's Men, and after that the King's Men when James first came to the throne. This group of players, these actors that performed these shows, were famous. People didn't really care who it was who wrote the plays. Playwrights themselves, I mean, like, for example, most of the soaps that are watched on television these days, very few people who love these soaps know who writes them. But let's say in 100 years' time, there suddenly becomes a cult of soap writers. Everybody wants to know who wrote, this soap and that soap. Well, it was something like that then. It didn't become important who wrote the plays until the reign of Charles II in the late 1600s, when suddenly, playwrights at that time became superstars. And so they said, well, who was this Shakespeare who wrote these plays? He's a great superstar. Let's find out who he was. And that's when somebody discovered this tomb in Stratford-upon-Avon.
So who wrote Shakespeare's plays?
I believe that William Shakespeare was to explain how that man himself wasn't educated enough, seemingly, to have written the plays. However, he did travel widely when he was with the theatre. So he could have picked up quite a lot of it. I believe that to try and use Shakespeare as a front man for having written the plays of somebody else is nuts, because you'd have chosen somebody like Ben Jonson, for example, who was a well-known playwright, probably this.
But you just said that people didn't care who wrote the plays.
Yeah, no, at the time, it didn't really matter that much. But if you're going to pick a front man just so that people who are close to you don't think that you're writing, but in other words, you're not picking a front man so that the world thinks, that person wrote them. You're picking the front man so that the Queen doesn't find out who's writing them. And a few people locally, in other words, the Queen goes there, she's going to hear, William Shakespeare wrote these plays. Anyway, fine, that's it. If she hears that Francis Bacon, one of her top ministers, wrote the plays, she might not be amused. If she finds out the Earl of Oxford, who she might even been having an affair with at one point, wrote the plays, she might not be amused. But some William Shakespeare, fair enough. So it wasn't, the world at large didn't care who wrote the plays, but the Queen and whoever went to see them might, if it turned out to be somebody who shouldn't be writing plays. And why shouldn't they be writing plays? A, because of some of the political points that are being put across she may not agree with. She was very fickle. She could change her mind all the time. Next thing you know, it's off with your head. But whatever reason you want to have somebody to front the plays, you're going to pick somebody who seems to be a playwright who's been to university and so forth, but they pick Shakespeare instead. And I think the reason is that he wasn't being used as a frontman. He did actually write the plays, but he was like the director of a team that wrote the plays. Basically, theatre, as we know it, started with Shakespeare, and he became one of the shareholders of the Globe Theatre, and he became the director of the plays. Before that, people tended to do just what they wanted. They didn't really have directors. And in the same way, he probably became the director of a writing syndicate that put them together. So if you want to know who wrote them, I would guess most of the people who were in the theatre group did it as a collective effort. And some of those, including Lord Strange, for example, who was part of the theatre group and one of their financiers, had travelled widely and did have the education to provide the information. So you didn't necessarily need a library. Shakespeare can come up with a brilliant plot. He can come up with some nice words. Helped by all these people, you then get the history to back it up, and you've got people there who speak in all sorts of different languages. That's my humble opinion about it, Stan. I mean, certainly, he in a particular 2-month period in 1595, he wrote 6 plays. I mean, that's impossible. I mean, you try. I remember when I used to write books using a typewriter. That was a nightmare. It used to take forever to write a book. You try and imagine writing a whole book with a pen, then crossing it out. Then imagine writing with a feather pen. You've got to keep sticking into some ink. And you're writing on parchment or paper which is in short supply. You can't just keep ripping it up and chucking it in the bin. I mean, it's going to take forever. I mean, you don't have to write 6 plays in 2 months. And not just 6 any plays, the greatest works that have ever been written. So there must have been more than one person working on them.
It was like a production company. Shakespeare.
Precise. Shakespeare was a production company. And I think this is why his face looks so weird on the cover. The first folio of Shakespeare's works, the first published edition of his works, that you could go out and buy, was printed in late second decade of the 1600s, 1620 thereabouts anyway. And all the people Shakespeare had just died, and at the beginning of this work, various playwrights and other actors in the theatre and so forth all write kind of epitaphs for Shakespeare, oh, he was a great guy and all this kind of stuff. And it was these works were all published under the collective name Mr. William Shakespeare. But underneath, it's got all these other names. Everyone assumes that it says published by Mr. William Shakespeare. The actors were as follows, or the rest of the company were as follows. But it just says published by Mr. William Shakespeare, plus a load of names underneath. And you could read that to being plus these people. It depends which way you actually look at it. And on the cover of the book was a woodcut sort of black and white picture of William Shakespeare, the one we tend to all know and love with the bald head and the beard, etc., which is what the figure looks like who's on the bust in Holy Trinity Church, bald-headed man, beard, etc. But he looks really weird. He's got 2 left eyes. His mouth is a different shape on one side or the other. His hair's cut differently. I remember somebody suggesting it was a composite picture of all the people who actually did write the plays under his name. That's why he looks so weird. Now, did Shakespeare really look like that? Well, I think I can say categorically no, he didn't. Because remember the bust in the church in Stratford-upon-Avon has the same bald-headed, pointy, bearded man. Well, when I told you there was a very early drawing of that tomb made in the early 1600s, that, which has the man with his hands on the malt sack, he has long hair, full head of hair, and a very much pointier beard with a long moustache. And he's thin, not a sort of rather plump fellow like Shakespeare we know and love. So, no, he didn't look like that. So why, if the bust is anything like him, and it was made by people who knew him, and for people who knew him, then he must have looked something like him. So why did the people of his fellow playwrights and the people in the theatre company depict him as this bizarre-looking hodgepodge face man, unless he was a composite figure, but said, meant to represent the entire theatre company? That's my opinion, anyway.
That's interesting. And it's, Jesus, for example, no one really knows what he looked like either. That's just some artist's interpretation.
Well, yeah, I mean, Jesus, who's normally interpreted in art as being this blonde-haired, Caucasian, blue-eyed man, certainly wouldn't have been somebody who was kicking around in Palestine 2,000 years ago. But again, most of our idea of what Jesus looked like comes from the Victorian period. It was the 19th century in both Britain and America and throughout the world where people started to become really interested in history. And most historians tended to, getting hold of a lot of documents was very difficult for them. So they tended to make a lot of it up. So paintings began to appear of Jesus looking like he did. And myths and legends started building up about other historical figures, such as William Shakespeare. One of the legends, which is clearly legend, but everybody takes it seriously now, is that Shakespeare was born and died on April the 23rd. Now, it just so happens that there's no historical record that he was born and died on that date. April the 23rd is his birth and death day, and April the 23rd just so happens to be St. George's Day, the patron saint of England. Just like Patrick is the patron saint of Ireland, St. George is the patron saint of England, and St. George's Day is April the 23rd. So isn't it a bit strange that, which was well celebrated in Victorian times, the height of the British Empire, isn't it a bit strange that William Shakespeare, the greatest author of the English language, a kind of patron saint of the English language, happens to have been born and died on the day of the patron saint of England, St. George? It's another Victorian myth that was built up, plus all this thing about he had a lovely, happy family and he went to church every week, plus the fact that he was a nice, kindly man. Most of the letters that were written about him in Stratford-upon-Avon basically are people moaning about what a miser he is and how he won't let them have an extension on their loans. And as for in London, there's a number of cases where he's actually beating up or threatening to beat up members of his own theatre group. And he's a drunk. But then again, when you look at it, most great creative figures in history are either drug addicts, drunk, violent, or mad.
His father was a well-known usurer, and then he would turn around and become a creditor himself.
Yes, that's it. He knew how to play the system. Basically Shakespeare went into family business, and somebody actually once wrote about William Shakespeare during his life. One of the few things that we actually know that somebody is writing about his character in Stratford-upon-Avon, and said words to this effect: the Shakespeares, i.e. him and his father, the Shakespeares are renowned for taking money, but getting money out of the Shakespeares, well, seeing is believing.
Well, that's why he was running up debts in London.
Well, maybe that's a possibility. The man, although he was getting thousands and the equivalent of thousands of dollars in Stratford,
it's just a cheap bastard.
Just a couple of dollars saved here and there. Well, save the pennies and the pounds to look after themselves.
So whatever happened then to the lost, unpublished plays of Christopher Marlowe? I can only imagine that the Shakespeare production company kind of inherited them as their own.
Well, yes, this is, again, another reason why after a while, when I said Shakespeare probably did come from Stratford-upon-Avon, they let me back into the Shakespeare Centre. My picture was taken away from under it, and the girl on the reception said, "Oh, Mr. Phillips, you can come in now, I'm so pleased." She obviously didn't agree with banning me from the place. And so I went there, did some research. A couple of weeks later, I found I was being banned again. The second time I was banned was not for saying he was a spy. They could just about handle that. The second time I was banned is because I said that there was a possibility that Shakespeare's early works were plagiarized from Christopher Marlowe, the playwright who had died when he became famous himself, when Shakespeare suddenly became famous. And for example, one of the last poems that was written by Marlowe was called Hero and Leander, and was a love poem. set in the ancient world. Shakespeare immediately then is patronised by the Earl of Southampton, who had been patronising Marlowe before, and his first poem that he had published was called Venus and Adonis, which is another love story set in the ancient world, which is very similar to Marlowe's original, although Marlowe's original wasn't discovered for many decades later, so Shakespeare probably thought he could get away with it. And the first couple of plays Shakespeare writes are very similar to Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe is probably most famous for writing the story of Dr. Faustus, you know, the man who sold his soul to the devil. A lot of the wording in that and the way he writes and is similar to William Shakespeare's first plays. In fact, there was when I published my book, there was a group of people at the time who used to shove people's works through a computer and work out how many times certain words were used in sequence. And they believed that if you worked this out, you could tell whether that person who wrote that also wrote that. It was something that was used by the police. And they actually said that it was fairly obvious that at least some of Shakespeare's first plays were written by Marlowe. In other words, he got hold of Marlowe's unfinished works and finished them off. But then the later plays become different. So he started life as somebody who left his wife, and somebody who was working for the Secret Service, and somebody who beat people up, and somebody who was a drunk, and he's a plagiarist. What I absolutely do admire about him is he made theatre the sort of thing it is today. If it wasn't for the theatre then, we wouldn't have got the entertainment that we know in the form of theatre, which probably wouldn't have turned into the movies in the 1900s. And the reason he was able to make theatre so popular is, first he said, we must have a permanent home, so organise the building of the Globe Theatre. He also said you have to have a director, and he was brilliant at promoting the thing. He actually he was the first person that we actually know of in history who got people to wander around the streets of London with sandwich boards on them advertising the shows. He was a great manager. He got everybody working together. So whatever else he was or wasn't, it was down to him that theatre became what it did. And if he didn't live, it probably would never have taken off, regardless of what kind of a guy he was.
Got an audience question here. I don't know what you'll make of it, but were his works actually produced by the high priests as a form of mind control and a way to implement the ultimate slave language, modern English?
Shakespeare was certainly used in the Victorian period as a kind of icon of English. The language of Shakespeare should be the language spoken throughout the British Empire in India and places that have their own languages. So Shakespeare became a sort of patron saint many years after his death. The people who were producing Shakespeare's plays, if you like, when he was alive, seem to have been putting a lot of money behind it for a very practical reason, because they were using that theatre company as a arm of the Secret Service. It was brilliant. I mean, at the end of the day, Francis Walsingham did manage to invent a plot that Mary Queen of Scots was involved in and had her executed, which meant that her son, who was a Protestant, James I, became king afterwards. It completely changed history. I mean, it was a very successful enterprise by Walsingham, and if he didn't have such things as Shakespeare's Theatre Company, he wouldn't have found out all the information he needed to, and the contacts to basically trump up all these charges against Mary Queen of Scots. So I don't think there's any high priests involved, but there's certainly Lord High Executioners, Spy Master Generals, and those who wish to promote the British Empire.
What about this phrase, the ultimate slave language, modern English? What the heck does that mean?
I assume that whoever's saying this is talking about the fact that people in India were made to speak English instead. You know, they're part of the British Empire. You must speak English, the English of Shakespeare. The slaves when Britain still had slavery on the plantations in the Caribbean, These people all had their own language, but they were obviously told they must speak in English, which is the language of Shakespeare. And remember, I said earlier, it is also if you realize the Bible is written in the same style as Shakespeare's writing, then it is the language of God. And I am sure this is the sort of thing that slave plantation owners told their slaves. I think that's what they probably mean by it, but I might be wrong. But Shakespeare definitely was used as a kind of patron saying, you speak like Shakespeare, speak the English of Shakespeare, it's the English of God. That would have been the Victorian idea.
Were his plays a form of propaganda?
Shakespeare's plays were almost certainly a form of propaganda. Take, for example, Richard III. He depicts Richard III as this horrible, evil, hunchback man. Richard III, he's the guy that locks his nephews up in the tower and all this. Richard III got a really bad press, and Shakespeare was... Shakespeare finishes Richard III off by saying the words, my horse, my kingdom for a horse. The man's a coward, he's on his own, he's surrounded by all the enemies, and he's sort of, all he can say is, oh, my horse, my kingdom for a horse, because he's lost his horse. Whereas in reality, historically, the last words that Richard III said were treachery, 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 referring to a number of his men that turned around and joined the other side. There's no evidence he was a coward or a bad king or anything. But the person who beat him at the Battle of Bosworth Field was Henry Tudor, who was Henry VII of England, the father of Henry VIII, the grandfather of Elizabeth, the Queen at the time of Shakespeare. So in that respect alone, yes, there is propaganda involved in it to bolster the Tudor claim to being the legitimate monarchs of England.
But Elizabeth was the last of the Tudors.
She was the last of the Tudors. After that, by the time James I came to the throne, he was a Scottish person, so that's when Shakespeare writes the Scottish play that we're not allowed to mention in case you get bad luck. Or I'll say it, Macbeth.
I like Macbeth. They teach that in grade 11 English.
I think Shakespeare is the only playwright that I know of, or even writer of any kind, that nearly all the schools in the English-speaking world teach kids. All kids in English at schools, in England, Canada, and America, and Australia, and New Zealand, they all do Shakespeare. They don't do Christopher Marlowe or Ben Jonson or Sheridan or George Bernard Shaw, or I don't know any Canadian playwrights, so please forgive me. But if there are some, they don't tend to do them. So there you go. But it's just Shakespeare. He certainly seems to take the world by storm. Whoever wrote those plays, now however many people are involved in them, you cannot deny that they have some incredible appeal and are presumably works of absolute genius.
It is kind of taken as history, like Julius Caesar, Et tu, Brute. That's not necessarily history.
No, absolutely. No, how does he know? Was somebody writing down the words as Caesar was being stabbed to death by these senators?
But if you were to ask somebody what were the last words of Julius Caesar, they would say that.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah. So you writing anything new, Graham? This conspiracy of Shakespeare that we've discussed today is an older book, but it's a timeless topic.
Well, when I wrote Shakespeare, I actually called it the Shakespeare conspiracy, because conspiracy wasn't a dirty word in those days. So the book I'm writing at the moment, and I've just finished writing, perhaps could be called the King Arthur conspiracy, because it's all about how King Arthur has been used and manipulated and used as a figure in a medieval propaganda exercise. But as the word conspiracy is now not on, it's going to be called King Arthur Revealed, and I hope it's going to be out later this year.
If you want to learn more about Graham Phillips' work, what's the website, Graham? GrahamPhillips.net. Just imagine me with a net on my head. It's not .com, GrahamPhillips.net. Graham Phillips, thanks so much for being a guest on the program.
Okay, Russell, thank you very much indeed.